another skill that you need to master pretty quickly whenever you get into clinicals, just to save yourself some time and aggravation and some conflict with the technologists that you're working with, is basic X-ray tube manipulation and control. So what you'll see on your X-ray tube, and on this one specifically, is that it is, I guess it's kind of got a biometric control on this handle here. If you touch it, it'll move pretty much anywhere in the room that you want it to go. So you've got that. If you see a button that kind of looks like an asterisk, that does essentially the same thing as just grabbing this thing, and it will take it pretty much anywhere you want to go. Not real sure why the Fuji system has both of them, but it doesn't really matter either way. It is what it is. So if you look at the buttons and you kind of study them pretty closely, you can kind of figure them out. So this one's got a line and an arrow that kind of goes in two directions. So naturally that's going to be what you use for your longitudinal centering. You can see the X-ray table right there. So longitudinal means with the long axis up. This button is one that you're going to use if you're having to do things like, I don't know, decubitus or cross table exams. So you hit that one and the X-ray tube will swivel around that way. This one pivots the X-ray tube. So where it's pointing at the floor right now, if you needed to point it at the wall bucky, you could turn it just by pushing on that button. And notice it's got a lock in, so it secures itself pretty sturdy at 90 degrees. But you've got an indicator if you're needing to make an angulation that's not 90 degrees, you've got an indicator right there that tells you how much of an angulation you have on your X-ray tube. So you have 0, it locks in at 90, and then if you were doing something like a foot, then you would, it kind of gets close to one of those two, and it gets a little grabby. But if you were shooting a foot, you might use a 10-degree angulation. So you can go anywhere from 0 to 90. You can even go past 90, in this case up to 125 degrees. Over here, what we have is an arrow that goes up and down. So if you push that button, it'll raise and lower the X-ray tube. This one is a little bit more complicated. This is, you know, they can't really do two that have the arrow pointing up and down. So this one represents going just across. So across the table, across the short axis of the table, lengthwise, crosswise is what we're looking at. So it's got two buttons to take it across the table. So what you heard just now was it locking into its preset detent. So if I'm shooting a chest X-ray, and I apologize if the motion is a little much, but if I'm shooting a chest X-ray, that's what my machine is set up for, is chest X-ray. That's our wall bucky right there. And our chest X-rays, we want to shoot at 72 inches. So if I tilt this back and we look up at the ceiling, I'm going to have to move this a little bit, look up at the ceiling, you should see where it is locked in or pointing to that 72 inches. I'll pick it up and bring it up a little bit so that you can see a little bit better. Hopefully you can see where that says 72. So that is what we refer to as a preferred detent. Our chest X-rays, we're going to shoot 72 inches. There are times when we have the patient upright for maybe an abdomen that we want to shoot at 40 inches. And what we'll do then, I'll pick you up again, and hopefully you can see where it says 40 there. So what we'll do then is, if we're shooting an upright abdomen, we don't want to shoot at 72 inches because that's hard on the X-ray table. So what we'll do is we'll move our X-ray tube to 40 inches. And since we're set up for chest X-ray, it was a little bit hesitant, but it did finally lock in at 40 inches. So if your tech says, I want you to lock the tube in, that's what they're referring to. I want you to lock the tube in means that they want you to put it in a preferred detent. Now we're going to look back at our x-ray tube, and our x-ray tube is shooting directly at the floor. So we can't shoot a chest x-ray in our wall bucky because we're shooting at the floor. So common sense would say you've got to do something else. So let's back it back up to 72 inches. And sometimes getting it out of detent, it needs some hesitation. So we're locked back in at 72 inches here. So since we're doing a chest x-ray, we want to shoot into the wall bucky. So not only would I lock it into the preferred detent, but I would also turn my x-ray tube so that it's pointing at the wall bucky. Now, we've got one other thing. We have our distance right, but I want you to notice though that we've still got an issue, and that is that our tube is not aligned to our bucky. So these crosshairs need to correspond to these crosshairs. So I still have something to do. So what I need to do is take our x-ray tube, and this was the orange button, and line it up. We should have a detent there too. For whatever reason, it's not locking in. Let me try it again. There it goes. All right, so you get the audible. What I was doing in this case, again, I'm still learning the machinery. In this case, what I was doing is I was pushing the button, but I was also holding on to this. If you have the everything button pressed, or if you're hanging onto the handle, it won't give you a detent. So we're kind of learning here together. So notice I'm not holding on to the handle. If I grab the handle, no detent. But if I've got the orange button pushed, it'll lock in, okay? So when your text says lock in the tube for chest x-ray, they're talking about two things. One is you have to have it locked in up top, right? You got to be at 72 inches if you're shooting chest x-ray, but you also have to have it locked in transversely so that you're centered to the middle of the bucky. So if you notice, you've got one other thing that's a little bit off here. I'll move it a little bit closer so that you can see a little bit better. And that is, we're not completely lined up, right? So our crosshairs are here, and the crosshairs on the wall bucky are up just a little bit. So I need to come up some. So press the blue button, elevate my tube a little bit. Now I'm perfectly lined up. So it's basic tube operation. Familiarize yourself with the x-ray tube. Familiarize yourself with the preferred detents and where they are. We have another set of detents for the table. So if your technologist tells you to lock it into the table, first thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that you're not pointing at the wall. Make sure that you have it pointed at the table. You want to make sure, if you're using a system like this, you don't use this button or the everywhere button, but rather use the orange button, and you'll hear it before it locks in, and then it stops itself. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to use that or that. That's number one. And number two, you don't want to push too hard and too fast, or you may override your detent. Be gentle with your machine. It's very expensive, the x-ray tube. The entire imaging system is very expensive, so be gentle with it. So you've got that, but you've also got a detent for 40 inches, or you should have. We're set up on chest x-ray again. If I click this over to table, then it should give me the 40-inch detent. So they're locked in. You didn't get that audible beep, but it did lock in at 40 inches. So what you'll also notice potentially is that you're offset on the table. Okay, so this locks you in to the correct height from the image receptor. But what it does not always do is lock you into the center of the table. And that's because the table can move. What you need to get used to on the table bucky is kind of the same thing that you got used to on the wall bucky. And that is that, let's say we line our tube up to there. Okay, so we lock it in and it's pointing straight down to there. Our image receptor in this case is off by a little bit. So our image receptor is here. So after locking into the table, what you want to do is you want to align to the image receptor. And whether you move the image receptor or you move the X-ray tube, it really doesn't matter. That's a matter of personal preference. But you can move until the two are lined up. You see the laser, it points to these little dots indicating the center of the image receptor. Now you're aligned. From this point, you don't want to touch either the image receptor or the X-ray tube. What you want to do is you want to move the patient throughout. So now that those two are lined up, and this is probably the thing that you're going to struggle with the most. Once those two are lined up, you can push the button on the table and you can move the patient throughout the light field and radiation field. Before you get the patient into the room, what you want to do is you want to get the X-ray tube out of the way. If the patient hits their head on the X-ray tube, that's going to be an incident report. So you want to get it out of the way, have the patient get on the table and lay down before you put the X-ray tube over them. So the next thing you're going to do is move the X-ray tube into a position that is close to where you want to shoot the X-ray. So you get the X-ray tube up there. And the next thing would be to make sure that your X-ray tube and your image receptor are aligned. And there they are. The next thing would be to adjust your radiation field. So I'm going to get kind of close with this, but you can see your collimator dials, you've got 72 inches, 60 inches, 45, and 40. So let's say we're shooting the abdomen on this patient. For an abdomen, what we want is we want a radiation field that's 14 inches across the patient in most cases. If you have a very small patient, it can be smaller than that, and 17 inches lengthwise. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our collimators and adjust this to 17 inches. And if you notice, as I move that dial, we get a longer light field. And I'm going to adjust this other one. Again, this is the 40-inch arch here. So we've got 14 by 17 like that. So if we need to adjust the patient, again, what you don't want to do is you don't want to move your X-ray tube, because if you move your X-ray tube, you're going to have to move your image receptor as well. Once I have my X-ray tube aligned to my table, locked in, and I have my image receptor aligned to my X-ray beam, then I can just move the patient throughout the radiation field. So you push the pedal, and if we're shooting an abdomen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to center at the iliac crest with this line of collimation. That line of collimation is going to go straight down the patient's body. Until you really get good at it, what I would recommend that you do is get at the end of the table and take a look and make sure that the patient's not on the table a little crooked, just a little bit crooked. Sometimes can kind of fly right past you. So this is KUB, kidneys, ureters, and bladder. We're going to center at the iliac crest. The steps again are move the X-ray tube out of the way so the patient can get on the table. Once the patient's on the table, move the X-ray tube back, lock it in transversely, lock it in vertically, align it to the table bucky, and then move your patient throughout the light field. What you're going to have a tendency to do is if the patient is, let's say, here on the table, what you're going to have a tendency to do is you take the X-ray tube and you're going to move it. You're going to align it like that. And then you might or you might not forget to move the image receptor to correspond to the light field. And whether you do or not, you're still off because you're not locked in. Okay? So again, I know I'm beating this to death, but this is what you're going to have a tendency to mess up the most early on. Get the patient on the table, move the tube over the patient, lock in transversely, lock in vertically, align to your image receptor, and then forget all of that exists. The only thing that exists at this point is the button on the floor so that you can move the patient, and that light button right there. So you move the patient around, Put it iliac crest if we're shooting a KUB, as kidneys, ureters, and bladder for an abdomen. And you should be good right there.